Welcome to Policy Exchange. The title of this event this evening, "Is it time for a slimmed down civil service?" is in one sense slightly misleading, insofar as you'll have realised through your invitation that we actually want to talk about a whole range of issues to do with whether the civil service is fit for purpose. This evening we have an incredibly interesting panel, not just because the people on it are extremely distinguished and very knowledgeable, but also because they come from quite different perspectives. Now, Francis Maud will be here in about half an hour. He's currently stuck in a meeting, probably negotiating away with the unions, but he will be here in about half an hour. He, of course, is our serving minister in the Cabinet Office. So as well as the current minister, we also have an incredibly distinguished former Mandarin. Jonathan Powell, of course, was former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair when he was at number 10. Before that, he was an extremely high-flying diplomat, so he can give us the civil servant's perspective. And then from the outsider's perspective, we're privileged to have Lord Hennessy with us this evening, who's, of course, currently Attlee Professor of Contemporary British History at Queen Mary University of London, and an extremely distinguished thinker and author on a range of subjects, from the Constitution, administration, to social history and intelligence, so he can give us an extremely wide-ranging perspective. So we might start by thinking about the size of the civil service. The government, of course, at present is trying to shrink the civil service in a number of ways. It has a certain set of targets to do that, and that is, of course, not the first attempt to do so. We had the Gershon process before that. Over the last couple of decades, of course, we've seen a whole series of different types of reforms of the civil service with very different motivations. We had, for example, the next steps agencies. We had the new public management. We had attempts to do steering, not rowing, if you remember that. The sort of concerns that I think we might talk about this evening are things like the siloisation of the service. People often complain that the problems cross departmental boundaries, departments are not good at working together. We might think about whether the civil service is attracting the right kinds of people, the right calibre of people. We might think about whether it's basically got the right structure. In other administrations, they do things differently. In Sweden, the civil service is effectively just there to provide legislation, and large agencies do most of what our civil service does. In New Zealand, they have the Hive. We have all of our ministers together in an attempt to combat departmentalitis. We might think beyond the civil service. Of course, if people are complaining about the civil service, it might be because there's a problem with a machine, or it might be a problem with the way the machine is being handled. So we might also think about the relationship between civil servants and ministers. We might think about the role of special advisors and the relatively new departmental boards. We might even think about whether we should, like the European Union or France, have departmental cabinet. And lastly but not leastly, we might think about accountability of civil servants as well. Of course, in the news once again, last night we had Michael Howard here. He is famous for having raised some of these issues about who is really accountable, and Theresa May's recent travail have brought that issue back once again front and centre. So a huge range of things we might talk about this evening. I know that we have a very distinguished group of people in the audience too, so we'll have time for questions and answers. So I was going to start, if it's all right with you. We will have some speeches to start and then open out to questions and answers. But it's a huge privilege to have you here this evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Great pleasure to be here. I thought I'd do a bit of historical sweep as a warm-up for Jonathan, and Jonathan will then warm up Francis. Francis won't be aware of that because he won't be here, but it'll work all right nonetheless. Ladies and gentlemen, in the late 1980s, when I was finishing what turned out to be a rather big book, too big in fact, on Whitehall, I kept pondering why civil service reform, generation on generation, was such a tough task. Very, very tough task. Up to that point, I had only been able to list 3 successful reformers of the civil service. They were, in chronological order, Gladstone, the Kaiser, Hitler, and Mrs. Thatcher. And I'll explain in a minute. One might have been, which collector's item really, is Alec Douglas Hume, of whom I was very fond. And I went to interview him once on the job of being Prime Minister for a Radio 3 series. And I asked him about the civil service, and he enjoyed the diplomatic service, he relished them really, but he said there's too much paper, too many tasks, not enough clarity. And he said if I'd won the '64 election, my plan was to get one or other of the 2 most ruthless men I'd ever met to be my Minister for reforming the civil service, with just that as their task. One was Duncan Sands and the other was Enoch Powell. And I remember I saw Enoch for some other historical purpose shortly afterwards, and I said, did you know that Alec was going to invite you back into his cabinet if he'd won in October '64, and to make you Minister for the Civil Service, to reform it, root and branch? He never mentioned it to me, nor had he. I don't think he'd ever talked to anybody until this Radio 3 broadcast, but Enoch was really quite tickled. Now let me briefly explain Gladstone. The Northcote-Trevelyan Report of 1853, very short, very precise, not a word of jargon, based on bringing the exemplary model of the Indian civil service back home. The Indian civil service was the only place where clever graduates without family or money could go and thrive, unlike the patronage-laden Whitehall. And Trevelyan had been in the Indian civil service, and came back and wrote it as the staff at Northcote very quickly in 1853, and it represented the first attempt to introduce true meritocracy into Whitehall. So, calculation, N&T 1853 plus Mr. G equals meritocracy. It turns out that Beethoven was their unknowing patron, the great composer. I didn't know this till the other day, watching some series on the symphony. Somebody said to Beethoven on one occasion, is the van in your name an indication that you are an aristocrat? He said, no, it isn't. I'm a brain owner, not a landowner. What a terrific reply. Anyway, it was the charter for the brain owners to surpass the landowners, and it took a long time to do it. Queen Victoria couldn't abide the idea. She thought it was anathema. It would lead to all sorts of unkind results. And the Foreign Office resisted it until Lord Lansdowne was Foreign Secretary, last department to introduce it. But it worked. The problem was it was designed for the night watchman state, when the state did very little, apart from a bit of defence now and again when it was really pushed, Navy mainly, the licensing of Anglican churches and the occasional subvention for that, but it really didn't do anything. They were high-minded umpires. And that model was very powerfully entrenched by the beginning of the 20th century, when the state really began to do serious things, labour exchanges and so on, in the new welfare reforms of the Campbell-Banner monastic governments. But it didn't adapt. It didn't adapt at all, really, to the state getting into businesses for a very long time. The Kaiser, however, total war, did require them to adapt, particularly once Lloyd George became Prime Minister in the middle of this great crisis in December 1916. And the first thing he did was to get minutes taken of the Cabinet. There hadn't been any Cabinet minutes till then. The only record was the letter the Prime Minister wrote to the King once a week. And the model of the Committee of Imperial Defence, which is today's National Security Council, with rather less effective IT. But the Committee of Imperial Defence model was transmuted into the War Cabinet Office, out of which came the Cabinet Office. And LG, in the middle of that great crisis, saw putting the machinery of government straight as a first-order question. First thing he did, got Maurice Hankey, the great Marine, over from the CID to be the first Cabinet Secretary. Lloyd George, to use a phrase of Ken Morgan's, was an artist in the use of power, and he had a natural instinctive feel for its implementation, the mechanics of it. But the Kaiser, it took the Kaiser actually to shock Whitehall rigid to do it, and to set up ministries that did things like the Ministry of Food because of the U-boats, Ministry of Health. Haldane, the great Haldane, was commissioned by Lloyd George as the war was still on. He met just down here in Queen Anne's Gate in a little house. You can see his plaque. The Kaiser coveted Haldane's house. He called it Haldane's doll's house. Nice little place. And they met in there. And Haldane produced this rational prescription for government, whereby research would be the precursor to policy making and action. We're still waiting. And also the departments would be structured in such a way that they reflected the themes of government. An anti-silo device, 1918 report, also recommended research councils, which we got eventually, bit by bit. The last of them was the Social Science Research Council. But in the peace, went back to normal. The problem with Whitehall reform under duress and total war is when that threat is lifted, it begins bit by bit to go back to the automatic pilot, which was the Northcote and Trevelyan model, like the state. But the state didn't take its hands off health and welfare. It extended it greatly again during World War II and after, but again it took Hitler. Though this time Whitehall did prepare much, much more effectively, partly because the war was foreseeable in the mid-30s in a way that it wasn't until probably 1911-12, in the case of the Great War. And the heroine of my book on Whitehall was Beryl Power, who was an assistant secretary in the Ministry of Labour and Social Service, and she was sent to what's now a tyre shop in Chiswick to draw up a list of all the clever people you would need from both industry and the universities to run a command economy in wartime. And she drew up this list because they realised that in the Great War, the intellectuals had been sent to the Somme and where else, and were by and large had a 2-week life expectancy once they were at the front. And this time they weren't going to have the brains blown out of the people you needed to lick Hitler. So Beryl Power, who deserved a great honour which she never got, put this list, had this list ready to go in 1939. Wonderful. And again, it was Albert Speer who said to, when people were allowed to interview him first, that your Mr. Bebbing could do things in your country that I couldn't do here, without the apparatus of a totalitarian state and emergency powers which he had, which he very rarely needed to use. And one of the most effective things the Ministry of Labour and National Service did was to bring in both the industrialists and the intellectuals to do it. And the industrialists, by and large, came in and ran the bits of the siege economy that they would have run if we'd had a free market. The Potato Marketing Board, I think, took over St John's College, Oxford, which turned it into the biggest chip shop it's ever seen. And it did work, because it found people like Oliver Franks, who were naturally good at this and became permanent secretaries at a very young age. But again, tragically, after the war, they all went back. And the model wasn't seen as of any particular value for the peace. And Sir Edward Bridges, the head of the civil service, had 2 meetings in '46 with his fellow permanent secretaries saying, what can we learn from the war? And only Oliver Franks, who was still there, said, you need to apply some of those techniques to the peace because you're nationalising industries, you're constructing a huge health service. We're not going back to a night watchman civil service, but they didn't listen to it. Mm-hmm. So another opportunity for reform was lost. They'd had the war as a test bed in how to do a much more active civil service, and they threw it away. Well, Mrs. Thatcher was the next one. Fulton was a great missed opportunity. Harold Wilson commissioned the Fulton Inquiry, which had many good bits in it. A lot of it was bollocks on stilts, really. I mean, the usual British obsession with class and status and the neurosis about Oxbridge got in the way. Pathetic, really. But it had good things in it, but Harold lost interest in it and lost office. Ted Heath wanted his new revolution in government, which was constructed on a different basis. And very little happened because of Fulton. And William Armstrong, who I like very much, got bored with implementing it as head of the civil service and was terribly pleased to be asked to be Ted Heath's economic advisor in effect, because Ted didn't like the Treasury because they were always rubbing his nose in reality and they were not wildly enthusiastic about Europe either. So that all filtered away. But Mrs. T was a phenomenon. Mind you, she had to keep winning elections before people realised that this was serious. And I thought it was brilliant to get Derek Rayner in and to get quick studies done of how to do things more efficiently in the doing side of the civil service, which had wider lessons for general application. And I was a great fan of Derek Rayner's. I also was a great fan of the Next Steps, which was an invention of Mrs. Thatcher's people towards the end of her time when John Major implemented it. So it took Mrs. Thatcher, Derek Rayner and the British electorate, plus a mother and father as we saw it then of a recession, but of course it looks quite manageable now, in the early 80s, and significant cuts by the standards of peacetime to drive all that through. I'm going to leave Jonathan to talk about more recent times, and Francis will tell us what the coming plan is this time when he arrives. But why is it so difficult to reform, ladies and gentlemen? Well, you might think this is complete nonsense, but I've got the odd thought. Aristocracies of talent with tenure are very difficult to shift by transient, fleeting members of the political class. That's the anthropological explanation. If you get very clever people in young, and you institutionalise them in the non-pejorative sense of that word, and they acquire considerable knowledge, not just of their own department, but of the system, it's very hard to shift them, very, very hard indeed. So aristocracies of talent are absolute buggers to reform, not least because they use courtesy as a weapon. And are a tremendous resistance movement. They're like Moscow, really. They just wait for snow and time to take care of you later. Another factor is what we now call legacy. Departments created at a particular time for a particular purpose take on a life of their own. It's Mary Douglas in the social anthropological approach again, how institutions think. And it's a structural, architectonic explanation, that one, once you've got it set up. And it was Bernard Williams, the philosopher, who, in a Radio 4 discussion I was chairing once, a long time ago now, 1990 I think it was, said, think of the people who set it up and the purpose they set up the institution, because the language of that institution, its mores, just carries on like DNA. And the example he used was the European coal and steel community. And I think that's my words rather than Bernard's, but he said the problem for the Brits is that they didn't invent it, you see, because the creation of clever Catholic left-wing French bureaucrats. Clever Catholic left-wing French bureaucrats. Most Brits, Bernard said, have got a severe problem with 3 of those 5. And that also applies to government departments, I think. Thirdly, the sheer time-consuming hell of firefighting when you're ministers or special advisors or senior officials, it means there's very rarely time to take on the heavy lifting which is required to reform the civil service. It's the overload explanation, that one. Everybody's too knackered. And finally, the temptation to use the language of transformation while always avoiding the big question of what the state should be doing and what it shouldn't, and how much GDP should it absorb. That really is the problem. We've never confronted that. And so many reform attempts suffer from what I call the Eurovision Song Contest syndrome. Fabulous setting, overall content. Now that was 20 years ago I came up with those explanations. There have been a lot of changes since, which by and large I hadn't anticipated because I'm a terrible forecaster. Cumulative change. The agencies work through, by and large, a great success story, I think, both in terms of productivity and customer care. Easily discounted now, but they did make a difference. Market testing and outsourcing in the major years was very considerable, and in your time. And when you add it all up, it turned out to be a remarkable hollowing out in many ways of the old state, and very controversial. And some of it will come back like a burp to haunt us, PFI, for example. Big time, I suspect. Huge churns of people in the department, so they lost collective memory, which weakened the DNA model. And lots of outsiders of 3 kinds, temporary recruits to jobs that formerly life has only held, consultants, too many of those, and spats. Now, the period since 1989 I won't write about, because you can only do a book of that magnitude once in your life, unless you really are totally obsessional, which I'm not quite. So somebody else will, people are chronicling that period. One gap, however, I'm sad Francis isn't here yet, because he and I talked a bit about it at a seminar before the 2010 election, and it's this. Once Labour got out of, at least on paper, being committed to having a great fight of the boundaries between the public and the private bits of our endeavours, with Tony's speech in '95, was it at the conference? It's occurred to me that the boundary dispute that had wasted so much time and energy since Labour put it in Clause 4 in 1918, I mean, what a lot of energy went into that. Such nonsense. But once we got through that, we could begin to train people, both from the public and the private sectors, about the partnership you genuinely need to manage a state that's anything other than passive, and to get to know each other. Because one of the problems I'd always noticed, I went to the thing called the Node, which probably stopped now, but the senior civil service used to go to this place in Hertfordshire with the private sector, when they were about to become under-secretaries, or they were under-secretaries, grade 3s. And quite often they'd known the people at college, but the difference in their experience between the age of 22 and 42 meant that they were strangers to each other in terms of the way they thought and operated. And the Node was a way of bridging that. And I've always thought that was a tragedy. And what we needed to do, once we got out of our boundary dispute, was set up the British equivalent of the École Nationale d'Administration of France. And you could have people from all sectors, and the not-for-profit NGOs, the lot, that were going to have to shift business, and to know about the other bits, all the other players. But we've never done it. And in fact, the National School of Government never got anywhere near, but it had some good elements, and it's disappearing entirely in March. I can't quite understand what's replacing it, because I think the word virtual is in there somewhere, which is something I've never managed to understand in my life. It's an age thing, the younger of you. So we're going the other way. So sadly Francis isn't here for me to try and evangelise again, but I do think that that would be a great asset for the state, whatever the configuration of the government, and whatever the size of the state, and whatever it was trying to do, if we could try and do something along those lines. There was always a problem when you said we need a British ENA, because it's French and therefore abhorrent. And we had to call it something else, the Something Institute, something with a nice herbivorous title, a bit of camouflage. But it's one of the things that we really needed throughout my lifetime and we've never had. So that's enough history. Back to reality.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not going to be able to match that fantastic review of history, the spread of history of the civil service, although I am glad now to understand why I have some problems with the civil service, knowing that it was formed by the Kaiser, Hitler and Mrs. Thatcher, which may sum up some of the reasons the Labour Party was so suspicious of it when we came to government in 1997. Now, I think I can speak fairly dispassionately on the subject, in that I was a civil servant for a different sort, but a civil servant in the diplomatic service for 16 years and then a political appointee for 13 years, and I have seen both sides of it. I would, and I see a good deal of civil services in other countries now, spending my time pottering around the world looking at other people's problems. And there is no doubt that we have one of the very best civil services in the world. But the trouble with it is that it's, because it's good, it feels disinclined to reform, and it desperately needs reform. Hasn't really had a breakthrough, almost, I would say, taking that spread of history, almost since the 19th century, a really, really fundamental reform. And there's a reason why two of the recent three prime ministers have talked fairly early in their time, and their scars on their back of trying to deal with the civil service, both Tony Blair and more recently David Cameron. Gordon Brown didn't talk about that, that's because he left scars on the backs of the civil servants, so it was the other way around. But there's a reason for that, and that is because the civil service is very impervious to change. It is essentially still a monastic order, which people join when they leave university at 21 and depart when they retire at 60 or a little bit later now. It's a civil service in which, yes, Prime Minister is still, unfortunately, not a comedy but a documentary, where much of what you see on that programme actually happens in reality. And as Peter was describing, it is very, very clever at resisting reform. And if you get that sort of sclerosis built into the system, the sclerosis that Manker Olsen talks about in economics, it's very, very hard to change it. We tried, we introduced 5-year contracts with the notion that people would leave after their 5-year contracts and go and do something else, but no one ever does. They always stay and get another 5-year contract. I think we'd be far better off if we had something more like the US system in this regard. There are all sorts of problems with the US civil service system, but what it does have is permeability. You have people who come in from outside, and you have people from inside who go out and get other experience. They will show you statistics that show that's happening more in the civil service. It isn't happening anything like enough, and until we have that, you're not really going to have a modern and reformed civil service. And that leads at its core to a sort of cynicism, seen it all before type of attitude that ministers find infuriating. When we first came into Number 10, we had a seminar with the Home Office on crime. And they produced a series of detailed, very colourful charts that showed us that crime would go up inexorably over the next 10 years. And Tony asked why this was that crime would keep rising, and they said because the economy is going to grow, so there'll be more stuff to nick, so there'll be more crime. I asked what would happen if the economy turned down, and without missing a beat, they said the crime would rise, because there'd be more poor people, and there'd be more people needing to nick stuff. So you get this sort of cynicism where people feel they really can't change anything, where they've seen it all before, ministers come and go, there's no point in trying a new initiative. I think there's a problem in the civil service both with mindset and skill set, and that would be changed if there was more permeability. I don't think I agree with Peter about ENARCs. The danger of an ENARC system would be that you would end up with even more of a pensée unique. But the pensée unique would not just apply to the civil service, it would apply to society as a whole. And that's the problem the French have run into in their industry and civil service, and they're now trying to break out of by having more entrepreneurs, more different points of view coming in. In terms of the skill set, I think there's also a good case for having more people coming in, because you need to have people who are project managers, people who can actually make things happen, rather than simply be mandarins dealing with policy. Now, every time a government tries to bring in those real sort of skill sets, they get absolutely monstered by the Daily Mail. They get attacked for paying these people huge amounts of money, what an outrage it is. It's a completely misplaced criticism. It would be enormously worthwhile for the taxpayer if we had someone who would come in and sort out the immigration service. It would be worth paying him tens of £1 million a year if he would sort out that system. So I think reacting as we did, and as this government does, to criticism on pay is completely misplaced. It would be far better to bring in real experts from outside and pay them properly. The civil service itself, I think, needs to be smaller, better paid, and more able. When we came into Downing Street, there's a wonderful institution in Number 10 Downing Street called the Correspondence Unit that deals with letters that come in. Usually what happens is they send the letters off to departments and they never get replied to at all. They simply send a letter back saying this has been referred to the Treasury or Department of Health, and their reply goes, We were slightly surprised when we were contacted by Tony's dad about 3 months after we'd been in government, who said that he'd written to Tony and hadn't had a letter back from him congratulating him on his success. And he'd just received one that day, 3 months later, which was addressed to Dear Loving Pa. Thank you for your letter, your views have been noted. There are plenty of civil servants, but the problem is often the calibre of them because of the way the system is made. There is an enormous case for actually, if you could do it, to reduce the size of the civil service, but to try and keep the really good people to have much smaller civil service that was more capable. We tried to do that in various departments by isolating the headquarters from the parts that involved in delivery. For example, in the health service, we separated the Department of Health from the NHS proper. You can then reduce the size of those headquarters substantially. You can really make them much, much smaller, just as a company does in the modern world. We have very, very small headquarters. Again, it worked, but all we really did was displace people. We managed to make the headquarters small, but all that happened was that people moved elsewhere in the system. I think you'll really only get the change you need if you can bring in an outsider, someone who's been in business, who takes command of the civil service and can really bring about change. I very much welcome the fact that the Tories have managed to split the job of Cabinet Secretary into 2 roles. It's something we tried to do twice and were seen off by the civil service in trying to do. It's clearly the right answer for the problem. Just praising the Conservative Party, so praising you for separating the Cabinet Secretary from the head of the civil service. It's something we tried to do twice and were seen off both times by the incumbent Cabinet Secretaries. And the fact this is being attacked by ex-Cabinet Secretaries strikes me as a validation of the reform, and excellent evidence it's the right thing to do. The thing that I regret is that the Tories actually chickened out of ensuring that the head of the civil service was not a permanent secretary, but in fact an outsider. We would be far better off if we had someone from outside who really have a new approach, have a fresh approach to the civil service. Of course they'd make mistakes, of course there'd be trouble, but if they were given real authority to try and get a grip of the top 5, 6 levels of the civil service, to be not a primus inter pares with the other permanent secretaries, but someone managing them from a management point of view, you could then get real changes that we've failed to do so far. I mean, I admit that we have, when we were in government, we did fail to bring about reform. And the problem really, when it comes down to it, is the one-way bet that civil servants have. In the case of a civil servant, you are very rarely praised for having brought something about, for having taken a risk and really changed something, but you will be completely and utterly punished if you get anything wrong. If you remove a regulation that allows some disaster to happen in a nightclub or a farm or whatever it might be, then you will be punished. If you've done something that removes a regulation and makes something work more smoothly, you will never ever be rewarded. I think it's only when we can get the incentive system to change, where civil servants really get recognised in their annual reports and the way they're treated, if they bring about change and take risks, then the civil service itself will change. And that means a bit of responsibility and accountability for civil servants, to actually have named civil servants responsible for changes. When an agreement is reached on what's going to happen, there should be one person who is responsible for that. They should be held accountable if it doesn't happen. If it doesn't happen for reasons beyond their control, they need to say so as the process is going along and get those changes made. If they just sit there and blame the system and hope that it all goes away, or the minister will be changed, or a new government will be in, then we will never get real reform. So I think that I confess to the fact that we failed to change the civil service. I fear this government too may fail to do it. It is a very, very difficult task. We have moved beyond the 1970s. In the 1970s, the civil servants were really the ones who were the continuity of government. They were the ones who made the decisions with very fast rotating governments. That changed with Mrs. Thatcher, who was in power for a long period of time, and got to know subjects better than the civil servants themselves, and was able to make decisions much more quickly, which meant the decisions were elevated higher and higher to a political level, usually to number 10. It happened with us too. We were in power for a long time, and as a result, decisions got elevated. And that policy-making ability in the civil service was etiolated to a certain extent. I think we need to have a different sort of civil service if we're going to have governments that last for fairly long periods of time. I think there's also an issue to be, which I think this government is going to address, and we address to a certain extent, which is trying to delegate the work of the civil service away from the centre. It's far better if you can get the work done at a local level by teams from different disciplines. If you were dealing with crime, you don't want to just leave it to the police. You need to have the police, local government, social services all working together. Where we have created such teams, they tend to work extremely well, and there's no reason why most delivery shouldn't be put in the hands of such groups. That too would help you get away from the silo mentality that we have in our departments, again, which we failed to reform. If you could set up at the centre with junior ministers who frankly have almost nothing to do, if you set them up in charge of time-limited, cross-cutting teams with particular projects in mind, who would be disbanded when that project was met, you would have a far better impact on the public service, as long as they had the budgets that went with that. The problem has been so far, whenever that happens, they have no budget, they have to fight for the budget, and nothing ever happens. So in conclusion, we failed to reform the civil service. All governments come in talking about making the civil service smaller. It very rarely happens. Usually people just get moved around, because Thatcher never managed to really reduce it. But what governments do need to do is get the attention of the civil service. There's a wonderful apocryphal story about Mrs. Thatcher when she came to office with the BNOC, and she campaigned on privatisation of the BNOC. And after 3 months, she had a paper presented to her, some 300 pages, explaining why it was impossible to privatise the BNOC. She sacked the head of the civil service next week, and 3 weeks later she had a 30-page paper explaining exactly why and how the BNOC could be privatised, and that's what I would advocate all governments to do, to get their attention early on.
Great stuff, Jonathan. We've sort of been gradually moving through time from great history that Professor Hennessy gave us to more recent developments, and I wonder if we could now have a sort of an update on the current state of play from Francis Maud as well, before we open out into questions and answers. Thank you for making time this evening to come here, Francis. I know you're incredibly busy at the moment, so thank you so much.
No, thank you. And so sorry to be arriving sort of halfway through the event, but glad to pick up, arrive at just the moment of maximum compliment at the very end. Normally turns sour at the moment that I arrive. But I'll just say a little bit about what our plans are, and I'll just pick up a couple of points that Jonathan made at the outset. First of all, I mean, the new head of the civil service is an outsider. It's the first time the head of the civil service is not a lifer. Bob Kerslake has been a civil servant, I think actually only for 12 months. His background was a long time in local government. He was a finance professional. It's the first time that the head of the civil service is not a kind of mainstream policy generalist. His background was as a finance professional in local government, then became a chief executive, then for a short time was chief executive of the Homes and Communities Agency, and then became permanent secretary. So I think that's quite an important signal. His background is in operational delivery, not in the sort of pointy-head policy development. And I think that's a good signal. When I looked at the title of tonight's event, is it time for a slimmed down civil service? It seemed the easiest question I've ever been asked, really. But the answer is yes. And it already is being slimmed down. We made it absolutely clear that as part of the budget deficit reduction program, we were going to need to take out serious numbers from the public sector workforce. An essential element of enabling the civil service to be slimmed down has been that there was a civil service redundancy scheme in place which was penally expensive. It was virtually impossible to make people redundant from the civil service, unless you were actually, the only people you were making redundant were people who were young and junior and therefore relatively cheap. Some civil servants could, in some circumstances, admittedly a relatively small group, be entitled to 7 years their annual salary as a redundancy payment, which is absurd. So, I mean, we had to change that. The last government tried to change it in a relatively modest way, but PCS, the biggest civil service union, took it to court, got it quashed. Actually, the day after we formed the government, first thing landed on my desk was judgment from the High Court quashing the last government's relatively modest and I thought inadequate reforms to the redundancy scheme. We then legislated rather quickly to put through changes and negotiated arrangements with most of the civil service unions which are now in place, which are still very generous terms by comparison with anything in the private sector, certainly, and certainly way out of kilter with the statutory compensation scheme, redundancy scheme. But it still actually has now become affordable to make civil servants redundant, and a lot have been made redundant. And what's been good is that permanent secretaries and the managements of big government departments have taken the sensible management decision to front-end load the reductions in headcount, because there's no point in dragging it out over a 4-year period. You want to make these reductions relatively quickly. They can't all be done quickly, but you want to get to your sort of roughly what you expect the end state to be as soon as you can, so people know where they are. So it's slimming down, yes, definitely. It is happening, there will be more, and it is already, the numbers are dodgy because actually management information in the public sector is deplorably bad. But the numbers are in the civil service on a full-time equivalent basis, which I'm always a bit suspicious of, actually, because I want to know not how many full-time equivalents there are, how many civil servants are there. And actually beyond that, I want to know how many people are employed by central government in all of its different manifestations. And the numbers are difficult to track because there have been at different times, different workforces in central government have been reclassified. So you have groups of people moving in and out of the civil service, so it's very difficult to track the numbers. Sometimes cynics might think conveniently difficult to track the numbers, but it is unquestionably the case that the civil service is today at its lowest number since the Second World War. But there's more to go, and there will be more to go. I want to talk a little bit about our plans for reform of the civil service, and none of it's very radical or will sound very unfamiliar. And actually, there will have been people holding my job who will have said all of these things at various stages in the past. It's just that most of it has never happened. And the difficulty is doing it, is implementing it. And some of it's structural, some of it's to do with terms and conditions. Terms and conditions are eccentric. Some civil servants are entitled to 38 days leave a year, which is extraordinarily high, plus these quaint 2.5-day privilege days, which are extra days off in anyone else's language. And being entitled to 2 months holiday a year is quite extreme, really. And not only is that expensive, but it causes incredible discontinuity. If people are going to be away for, say, 4 2-week holidays in the course of a year, that kind of disrupts the ordinary flow of business. So terms and conditions need to be rationalised, and we've got a review going on of terms and conditions. But that's kind of technical, and it's important, and we'll make some progress on that. What else needs to be changed? Well, we talked about size. It needs to be less hierarchical. And I've pondered whether becoming flatter, less hierarchical, is that about structural reorganisation? And I'm kind of concluding that it isn't. You can do things with taking out layers, but actually what needs to change is not the hierarchical structure, but the hierarchical behaviour, where things will always tend to get pushed up the hierarchy. And this really bears on the point that Jonathan was making, which I absolutely support, which is about the risk aversion and the suppression of innovation. And I put it slightly differently from the way you put it, Jonathan, but I think it's essentially the same point. No one, and this is public sector wide really, not just civil service, no one's career ever suffers from continuing to preside over an inefficient status quo. So failing to change something that's bad is never a black mark. But try something new that doesn't work. First of all, try something new that does work. In fact, change which has involved risk gets past kind of a bit unnoticed and not rewarded. The PAC may occasionally comment favourably on something good that's happened, but of course nobody reports that because that's really, really dull. criticise something that's been tried and failed, that routinely will get done and published and receive publicity. What the Public Accounts Committee and anyone else will never ever do is commend something that was tried but didn't work. And actually the best organisations know that you learn more from the things which have been tried and don't work as you do from the things which have been tried and do work. And if you have this stultifying culture which condemns all failure is deemed to be culpable, and every failure must have a scapegoat, then you will never get innovation. And that's essentially why, during the last 12, 15 years, private sector productivity increased by 30%, public sector productivity actually declined. It got lower. And that's because the innovation, the quantum leaps that drive progression and dramatic progress are not people aren't able or don't feel empowered to try the new things that will lead to that change. And that's a behavioural and cultural thing. And one of the things I sometimes say, and it's not remotely original, it just seems so bloody obvious, is the civil service needs to be pacier, less paper-driven, less imprisoned by process, and that's about behaviours. And a lot of it's about ministers, actually. A lot of it is about what ministers expect from civil servants. But the thinking needs to be much more about outcomes and outputs and delivery, much less about process. I mean, I've gone through a process. I mean, the old joke, the civil servant who says to the minister, it might work I can see that it might work in practice, but it won't work in theory. We have to be thinking about what is this actually going to do? Is it doing it? And is it actually delivering what we said it was going to deliver? And how you change that behaviour is fantastically difficult to do, and I don't have the answers. Some of it is about performance management and the incentives and the expectations that are built into appraisal, and what behaviour gets rewarded and what behaviour gets does you damage in your career. And so that's really, really difficult to do, but we have to try to, and the odds, I say the odds are probably not better than 50-50 that we will achieve all of that. It won't be about, in the first instance, changing culture. I've, after a long checkered career, have concluded that you don't change the culture by trying to change the culture. You change the culture by changing behaviour. And if you can change behaviours, then that leads to a different culture, different expectations. So really, really difficult to do that. Other things we need to do, the civil service is very siloed, and people don't regard themselves as being, and aren't treated as being very interchangeable. The graduate fast stream entry, people join the civil service thinking they're joining the civil service. They find they've joined the Home Office or the Treasury or the Inland Revenue, and that's where they stay for the rest, broadly, for the rest of their career. We need to treat the fast stream actually as an interchangeable whole of government resource, with people expecting in their first 2 years, or whatever the right period is, before they go through some sort of graduation or passing out parade, to be, and you don't get through that unless you've done a number of things. And that would include going and working in some frontline office, delivery, operational delivery. It would include probably going and spending some time working in a small business, so you actually know what the effects are, and a voluntary organisation, so you kind of know what the effect, get some sense of what the effects are of the things that you're doing in government. Definitely spending some time in a geography outside London, whether it's elsewhere in the UK or abroad, and these are important. Most professional services, people type organisations will do this routinely. They will rotate people around, insist on people working in different parts of the organisation, and then actually manage it as a unified resource, a whole of civil service resource, not and then you start to build in cohorts of people who regard their allegiance as being to the civil service, to the government, not to the department, which is important. And you build up networks which operate. It'll take time to build that in, but you've got to start somewhere. Similarly, the senior civil service is theoretically managed as a single unified resource, but in reality it isn't, not even the top 200. The permanent secretaries and the director generals are not, the grades 1 and 2 in old money, are not managed as a single resource. And that needs to change as well. So more fluid, more flexible. Different ways of working. We have far too many people working in central London, in kind of Whitehall, and we underuse the property. We should be using the freehold property, the core Whitehall estate, much more intensively, have technology that enables people to work in all sorts of different places, much more fluidly, and we're light years away from that. We're locked into long-term contracts with different IT suppliers, with different systems, and it will take a lot of unscrambling, but we will unscramble it over time. I talked a bit about performance management. Performance management has been very weak, has been acknowledged to be very weak in the civil service, both in terms of the very good being rewarded and promoted and fast-tracked, but also in terms of the passengers being carried. And this is not good for morale. I mean, the hard-working, dedicated majority hate being treated in the same way as the people who don't turn up, who don't do the work. They hate it, and we shouldn't have had to do it, but a lot of poor performers have been managed out as part of the voluntary redundancy program. Actually, some of them should have been managed out on performance grounds, but it takes time to do that, and it takes time to build up the practices and the expectations where HR tells people that you can do this instead of generally telling people you can't do it. So that needs to become much more rigorous, and will do so over time. The last thing I think is about the reform of the civil service as it is about, and this is something that the Fulton report, which I'm sure Lord Hennessy referred to in his scholarly discourse earlier, I'm very sorry to have missed. One of the things Fulton referred to was the need to move away from the generalist, the domination of the generalist, and some of this has happened. You know, when I was last in government 20 years ago, finance directors were generalists, heads of HR were generalists, heads of IT in departments were generalists. And this was kind of, you know, you've got to go and do one of those jobs on your way to being a senior policy person and permanent secretary, but they weren't specialists. And these professional streams in government are now much stronger. Finance stream, the HR, IT, the CIO profession, the commercial directors, these are stronger streams. They're not always given the authority and the clout that they need in their departments, but what is still the case is that the heads of departments, the permanent secretaries, are still overwhelmingly policy mandarins who have come up through the policy route. They will probably have been made to go and do, sometimes in a kind of token way, a management delivery job, but actually they're people who come up through the policy route, and they're brilliant and very good and in high integrity and lots of intellectual horsepower, but they're not people who've come up through the any of the operational streams. And there is a class divide in the civil service. It's white collar, policy generalists, and blue collar, operational delivery, finance, HR, all of these other things. It is why it's such an important signal that the new head of the civil service is someone who has done operational delivery and comes from a finance background. That's a big departure. And we need more of that. We need more people who actually have come up through, who've been bloody good HR people. One of them becomes a permanent secretary of a policy type department. Similarly, someone who's done finance. I mean, none of that has happened in the past. So we need to have proper parity of esteem between the generalist Mandarin policy civil servants and the what are regarded as the blue collar, slightly below the salt streams. A final word about coming back to the beginning around size, because there is a lot of debate about what is the scope of the civil service. And in our Open Public Services white paper that we published, admittedly rather belatedly in the summer, we sketched out there how public services in the future need to be delivered, increasingly not by the public sector. And again, this is very much picking up a theme of the Blair government, not so much the Brown government, I think it's fair to say. And I know it would have gone much faster under the Blair government had it not been for the presence of Gordon Brown in the Treasury. But gratifyingly, this is now not a source of political controversy, particularly. It's agreed across the political spectrum. And we should increasingly see the end of the old public sector, in-house, bureaucratic, monopoly deliverers of public services. We'll see the end of the binary divide, that there seemed to be a binary choice between doing it in-house in a hierarchical in-house organization or outsourcing to a totally commercial private sector provider. There are many more models now, and we need to develop them more assiduously. I believe we will see the development of more public service mutuals, groups of public sector workers who come together to form a cooperative, spin themselves out, continue to do what they were doing, but on a contractual rather than a line-managed basis. Joint ventures, such as the one we're currently developing, which will administer the civil service pension scheme, which will be an interesting mixed model. 25% owned by the workforce, the employees, 35% retained by the government, 40% being sold to an outside private sector provider. It will release into the market a new enterprise with, I believe, entrepreneurial leadership, private sector capital, with a highly motivated workforce whose productivity is already increasing before we've even done the vesting and completed the deal. Productivity increasing apace. And there will be much more of this to do. And this requires a different kind of civil service and public service approach, because it means that many people in the public sector who have been line managers, bureaucratic line managers, and I don't say that in the pejorative sense of bureaucratic necessarily, but they will need to move from that role, the line manager role, to being a commissioner and contract manager. And the same people may very well be capable of doing the new skills that are required in this new world, but they certainly won't have those skills. And I made a speech at the beginning of this week about the new approach we will take to procurement. But to do that, which will be much more about engaging early with suppliers and informally with suppliers, to scan the market, use the input, the feedback from those conversations to fashion the procurement in a way that's much more about outcomes, much less about detailed inputs. So it's about the what, not the how of the service. But to do that, you need people in the public service who are able to engage in a confident, open, knowledgeable, intelligent way with suppliers, who aren't kind of constrained by sort of stultifying advice that says, oh, you must never talk to a supplier because it'll skew, it'll bias the competition. The law won't let you do it, the European Commission will infract you, or whatever the phrase is. And it's rubbish, actually. It's completely legal and very sensible, good commercial practice to engage early and informally with your supplier base and condition it and stimulate the creation of new suppliers, enlarging the universe of suppliers if that's needed. But it will require new skills and a new mindset. And part of that should feed back into the way in which in-house services are delivered, and come back to that point about being less imprisoned by process, being more focused on outcomes and delivery. So there's a huge amount to be done. we need to slim down the civil service and are doing so just on sheer efficiency grounds. We can't afford to have the same number of people working in the same way. But actually, over time, as we look to finding new models of delivery of public services, predominantly delivered not by the public sector, but by outside agencies of different kinds, whether in the social enterprise or the private enterprise sector, there will be a need for the civil service yet again to acquire different skills, different characteristics. And all of this will be really, really difficult to do because, as I say, there'll be plenty of people committed, ministers committed to public sector reform and civil service reform who've made brave speeches. And as Jonathan said, much of it has come to naught. We will aim to do better this time. Thank you.
Span of introductory remarks from the last century to the last decades to the government's plans for the near future. So I'm sure there will be in this very expert audience all kinds of interesting questions. If you'd like to put your hands up and say who you are and where you're from, we might take some together. Why don't we start with the lady right in the front row?
Lynette Nussbacher.
As I might will come and find you.
Thank you. Lynette Nussbacher, Nussbacher Associates, late at the Cabinet Office in Ministry of Defence. There has been a lot of talk here, a lot of fascinating talk about reshaping the civil service, reforming the civil service and slimming the civil service. And a subject which I think is fascinating and often abandoned by the civil service is strategy. There has not been much discussion of whether the fact that the professional civil service does not tend to think strategically, of whether somebody ought to provide strategic capability to ministers who are professionally unsuited to thinking strategically, at the risk of giving offense, and with respect to ensuring that the service delivery, whether by the private or public sector, is aligned in order to achieve strategic and therefore policy objectives.
Well, the only time I can think of in the lifetime of anybody in this room where Whitehall did think strategically was the Beveridge report. And it itemised 5 giants on the road to reconstruction: ignorance, idleness, squalor, disease, want. And what it said was, unless you hit those 5 giants simultaneously, the crust, the outer crust, the deprivation will not crack. And you need the equivalent in terms of what Francis was talking about. You need to pick up the 5 blockages, the 5 imprisoners, and see their interrelationships and work out which you're going to hit in what sequence, preferably simultaneously, to break through. And you sort of did that, Francis, but if you distilled it, you might meet Lynette's, who's a natural strategist, but you might meet Lynette's requirement of being a strategist. Because you did it in the way ministers usually do, which is very persuasive, it's conversational, discursive, narrative. So I would apply Lynette's question to you: what are the 5 things in order of magnitude, and how would you hit them all simultaneously? And what would it leave when you hit the buttons?
No pressure.
Is that fair? A summary of what you said?
Well, absolutely, and there's nothing wrong with being ganged up on by historians.
Yeah. But I'm not quite sure. I understand less, but the way you've
well, you've had lots of demons in here.
Yeah.
And you were very eloquent about them while being nice about the people, which I didn't mean equivalently. But if you had to itemise the problems, no more than 5.
Like Beveridge. Yeah, sure. That's strategic, but well, I mean, some of it you can do. I mean, it's. I mean, I actually have 8, but I think 2 of them are the same actually when I think of it. And I can't remember what they all are. But I mean, it's size, it's hierarchy, it's a lack of being too divided and too siloed. That's 3. It's the lack of pace the cultural, behavioural thing about lack of pace, innovation, process, too much process, all that. That's 4. 5 and 6, I think, is the same, which is more clout and authority for the non-policy streams and parity of esteem. 7 I didn't mention actually, but it is, well, it kind of is the same thing as project management skills. A lot of the things which go down as big IT failures aren't IT failures, they're project failures. Things that have been designed to be too complex because they're responding to too complex a policy, and then lack of project management skills. So I think project skills, together with what I was talking about at the end, the commissioning skills, commissioning and contract management skills, is a big must. So that's number 7. Number 8 is the performance management, intensifying that. And actually I'd add a 9, which is modernising terms and conditions. And some of these you can do relatively quickly. So you can start work on all of them at once, and some of them we have started on. You know, the terms and conditions, you know, first of all you have to find out what the hell there is out there, which is a hell of a lot, and it's incredibly complicated and dispersed. Performance management, rigor, you know, we've started on that. So I mean, some of it you can do quickly. The big piece, which is the most difficult piece, I don't have a strategy for doing it, frankly, at this stage. And it's the cultural, behavioural, deal with risk aversion, promote innovation, all of that stuff is unbelievably difficult in any organisation. And that will be Bob Kerslake's big challenge for us to crack together. Because you're not just doing it in a big organisation, you're doing it in a whole range of big organisations. And it's very, very tough to deliver.
We actually skipped on there slightly from, it's a very good question about Francis' strategy for changing the civil service, but the original question was partly also about just the civil service's ability to think strategically, as I understand it. I always can't believe that the only time that the civil service has been able to be strategic is the last time is the Beveridge report.
No, he was an outsider.
And he was an outsider.
He was such a pain in the ass that Ernest Bevins said, find something for him to do, because I never want to see him again.
Surely things like next stepping stones, for example, must be an example of just the civil service being, again, an outsider, but a strategic vision being pushed through the civil service.
I don't think the civil service regards it as its job to be strategic. It regards the job of politicians to come up with strategic visions, which is supposed to implement. It's supposed to be a body that implements it. It's not the civil service to sit there and come up with a strategy for Britain. And it is quite bad at doing strategy in all its manifestations, from the Foreign Office through to the Home Civil Service. And successive governments have struggled to try and make the whole system more strategic. Heath had his Central Policy Review staff, which he brought in to try and think great thoughts about the future of government and think things through, which had some interesting thoughts, but never really changed the world. And Mrs. Thatcher got rid of because it simply went around doing its ivory tower things and leaked its reports. We struggled with doing strategy properly. We had
Minister leaked its reports. The one that brought it down was the Secretary of State.
leaks are usually
I
Secretary
remember
of
the
State.
day it came into The Economist.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say who it was.
But so we struggled. We had Jeff Morgan inside number 10 in the policy unit trying to be strategic, but the trouble with that was he got dragged in, and he and a couple of people with him got dragged into day-to-day things. We then set up a strategic unit outside number 10. That fell into the usual trap of what's called SP, the State Department's policy planning staff, which is the oldest strategic unit in the world, set up by Kennan, who recently died. And the trouble with that is it alternates between thinking great thoughts and then being dragged into day-to-day things. Dennis Ross, when he was head of the planning staff, was dragged into day-to-day negotiations. Then you have heads of the policy unit who think thoughts have nothing to do with the Secretary of State. We had that alternation. Finally, we came up with something that more or less worked, which was subsequently published. But it's very hard. It's not the job of the civil service to have to come up with great strategies. There needs to be a way for governments to think strategically, and all governments around the world struggle with it, and I don't think we often find the right answer here.
There was a gentleman in the second row.
George Jones, NSE. To add to your list, shouldn't civil servants be asked, is your job really necessary? I have a feeling that what's going on by civil servants is totally unnecessary and is intruding into the work of other people. You've mentioned business. I would raise local government. We've just got this new monster of an act, the Localism Act, that contains pages and pages of scope for ministerial interference, civil service regulation, just in case local authorities do something that Whitehall doesn't like. I think there's a very good argument for getting civil servants off the back of local government. We need really decentralising what they're doing. The jobs can be done much closer to the local communities.
Well, I agree with that in principle. I mean, there have been people who, when asked, "Is your job necessary?" will have answered no, but they're way outnumbered by the number who said yes. So I think asking people to make themselves redundant is trying to hope over experience. That question being asked is a very good one. I have a weekly meeting in the Cabinet Office where before any vacancy is filled, however arising in the Cabinet Office, whether it's by an internal move or whatever, has to come to me to be approved. And so, great, because you find out lots about what's going on in the department you wouldn't otherwise know about. It suppresses demand because actually managers have to ask, do I really want to justify keeping this role? It's a very good piece of equipment.
Is that widespread in government, that kind of practice?
I don't know, actually. It's a tip I got from Michael Hasseltine, who did it when he first became a Secretary of the Environment. And it can get tedious after a time, but you learn a lot along the way.
You want to jump in? There was a gentleman who's in the fourth row, which is there.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Crennan. I specialise in sort of policy and communications in the education sector. And one of the sort of observations I've had, not just particularly in the case of DFES, but in others as well, but I will just give the example of DFES, is occasionally in the history of the civil service there are units that come about where outsiders come in force. They don't tend to have a very good shelf life when they do come to play. A good example is one called the Innovation Unit, which used to be the DFES Innovation Unit. Now, the main thing head teachers will fondly remember about the Innovation Unit is briefly, while that existed, some of the crazy solutions to non-problems that the old DFES used to come up with, which, you know, really added yokes of more of bureaucracy to outstanding and good schools in terms of paperwork. Some of that briefly stopped happening because the Innovation Unit gave head teachers a chance to get messages through to the people at the top, through the hierarchy. When that was outsourced, the DFES, I think, effectively wanted to move them on because they were probably disrupting the normal flow of management a little bit too much. They went out and they became a third sector enterprise, and after that their influence fell away. Very few head teachers now, if you honestly asked, would know what the Innovation Unit is. And I think that's a real shame that those kind of institutions sometimes feel that they have to go out into the third sector to remain relevant intellectually to the services that they're trying to help. And I just wonder, as you're talking about public service mutuals, not simply at the front line, but within the senior civil service, is there scope potentially for another round of bringing in externals into pre-created units that are specifically there for groups of external appointees to work together on projects? What Mr. Maud and the others thinking is in that regard?
Well, I think there is scope for it, and we should certainly be willing to do it. I'm not one of those who takes the view that the answer to every problem is to bring in outsiders. I think we need to be much better. I think one of the things we've got wrong, actually, is a kind of sense that whenever there's anything difficult, you need to get in management consultants to solve it. It's a kind of comfort zone. Actually, civil servants find that quite offensive.
But most of those were ex-head teachers, for example, in the Innovation Unit. That was what made it quite special. They were teachers and head teachers who came into the civil service.
Yeah, I'd much rather really good head teachers who are running schools rather than telling other people how to run schools. I think bringing people in from outside can work. It can be very good. I mean, the examples of sort of tissue rejection are very many. And one of the things we have to do as part of reforming civil service is to make its culture and behaviour create much less of a culture shock for people who are coming from the outside. It needs to feel much more like other organisations. People come in and they think they've landed on another planet.
I mean, outsiders get rejected in politics as well as in the civil service. When you try and put a businessman into politics, that's usually rejected by the system. But I think the only way you change that, is, as I said earlier, is to try and get the civil service away from being a monastic order. People will tell you the statistics have changed, there's much more in and out. That's like the statistic I got when I joined the Foreign Office in 1979. They were asked whether they do equal opportunities for women. They said yes, they had 50% of their employees were women, and I was absolutely shocked. I looked at the detail of the numbers, it was 50% of women were secretaries and 50% of men, they were all diplomats. So yes, they were 50% each. It wasn't exactly sex equality. So it's the same thing when you ask them for statistics about in and out. And it's only when you have real permeability in the civil service. People are actually told off their 5-year contract. You go out and go and find a new job, and then you come back after you've done something for 5 or 10 years outside. And if people are attracted in the civil service, as they are in the United States, where people do come in and bring new ideas in, I think that's the only way you change the culture. And to do that, you're going to have to change pay and pensions. You're going to have to pay them more to come in, because if you want to attract people from outside, you will have to pay them more to come into civil service. And you have to make the pensions less attractive, so people are prepared to go out and risk their pensions when they go out, and not worry about leaving and losing their pension in the process. It's only if you do that you will really change the culture, I think.
You can increase the chance of non-tissue rejection if you have half and half in the unit. The Central Policy Review staff, in its first incarnation, had the extraordinarily good Peter Carey, Board of Trade, as Victor Rothschild's #2, and it was literally half and half. And the civil service did actually send some extremely good people most of the time to CPRS. And the outsiders were very good too. They raised each other's game. But above all, you have to have an intelligent customer who really wants it. And Ted Heath did most of the time. Whereas successor prime ministers, they haven't invented it. So the shelf life problem is a very real one, particularly the not invented here syndrome, because you have to be quite a brave politician to admit that the outgoing rival government actually did come up with something very good. Though the policy is that's the great exception to all this. It's all these many configurations.
So David Cameron they had to reinvent it.
It's reinvented, yes. It had a tiny gap.
But would you apply that to more generally? 50% for units, does that mean the civil service will only really be permeable when you've got 50% from outside?
Well, that was the World War II experience, because they came in great numbers and they were doing, and also they'd been around a bit most of them. Of course, you can't do that in peacetime because you can't coerce people, and also there wasn't the shared threat. And everybody had rotten salaries in the war because that's the way it was. So it was much easier to do it in the war. But that's what I meant about Hitler and the Kaiser being these great reformers, because without them you wouldn't have been able to do it. Mercifully, you haven't got an equivalent, though the collapse of the Eurozone and the growth might be something that France has just achieved.
There's definitely a second one, there's a couple of questions behind. Very appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks. Elaine Simpson from Serco. I look after the education business in Serco. I'd like to take us back to the issues of commissioning and accountability, and two things that I'd love to hear the panel's view on. First of all, in terms of commissioning, it's not only mixed in the civil service, it's it's almost non-existent. There's some good bits of procurement, but commissioning itself is a very different thing. And I just want to hear what people think about that. And then the second thing is that commissioner-provider split, because I spent a long time, 25 years in local government, and then moved across into the private sector as a provider. And I was never held so robustly to account as I was after I moved. Excuses that I could get away with when I was also talking to my employer around, old Bill, not really very good enough as an educational psychologist. I could get away with that. Once we had a commissioner-provider split, I was dead. And that was very important in terms of improving services. And I worry sometimes that if we don't create that split, we will never get that quality of service that we really need.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. I think it isn't just creating the split. You're quite right about the difference between commissioning and procurement. And we do get what we do in this country is procurement, and it's very legalistic and technical, and you have competition and you choose the cheapest. But actually, you haven't necessarily bought something that's good value, because we do it the wrong way. And the commissioning part is really important. but so is the bit that comes afterwards, which is the contract management, which is where you're held to account. And so it's no good creating the split unless you also create the skills to hold the provider to account in that way. So I think it's a very, very good point.
Well, I'm most intrigued to find that the big problem of procurement, which is the weaponry. And two of my mentors, John and Keith, are here and know exactly that business and I don't. And the real problem comes when you've got only a small number of suppliers, if you need to retain sovereign capacity, which you by and large do in defence. The rest of the world can globalise like buggering, but you're not going to let anybody else build your arm to kill at the front end of your nuclear weapons system. And these problems are enormous. And that's the bit I'm most interested in. Bernard Gray's report is imminent. It's been imminent for a while, I think. But that's the one to look for. And tomorrow you're just thinking, oh, how interesting.
A week tomorrow.
A week tomorrow.
It's a really slick. Why don't we take your question and the lady next to you, and then we'll go back.
Maybe take some batches of questions. Keith Leslie, Deloitte. An observation and then a couple of suggestions. An observation would be that maybe structural reform of the civil service is hard because it involves trade-offs. And as soon as you improve one axis, for instance, functional expertise, you then have people staying longer in a certain area and you get more silo effects. You build capability and then you become attractive to the public sector, so you have to pay more to hang on to them. So maybe the key actually is, from my point of view, the behavioural reform of the civil service. And for me, the key thing would be to break down some of the boundaries. So there's a much more permeable boundary between public servants, private sector, and voluntary sector, so that you can actually see what innovation, appropriate judgments about risk and so forth actually look like. But it would have to happen much more intensively at many more levels than today. A couple of institutions that could be used to help this, when Peter was highlighting, we don't have an EMA. We do have the National Audit Office, who do fantastic, high quality, credible, independent research. But they pick on areas where things go wrong. So Parliament, because I don't think ministers can ask them to do this, but Parliament could ask the NAO to do equivalent reports on what were the best 10 experiments of the last 12 years, whether they went well, whether they went badly.
I had suggested exactly that too.
Thing to do. And then the final one is, I'm partial with the fellow there, the Windsor Leadership Trust is on a small scale the British equivalent of bringing together public servants, private sector and voluntary sector. So there are institutions we could use more.
Let's pause that thought and we could take a couple of questions at the same time.
Okay, mine was Tina Hallett, PwC. Mine was picking up the behavioural change point and Jonathan's point about civil servants being more agile, needing to be more commercial and risk takers. And as you said that, and Francis ended on the behavioural point, I was thinking of the media coverage around Brodie Clark recently, and I was wondering what you thought the impact of that was on civil servants being willing to take risks and be agile, or whether that, as I listened to it, I felt that might well set us back again on a journey this government is trying to do.
We might take just one last question in this batch, and there's a gentleman in the yellow tie there.
John Gilbert, the oldest member of Mr. Blair's first government. How that came to pass, I'll never know. Jonathan Powell certainly does know. I haven't had the nerve ever to ask him, but never mind that.
Can't you tell us now?
Greatly daring, I want to say one or two things to Lord Hennessy. You can't surely think that cabinet minutes have done very much to reform the process of government in this country. Anyone who's ever read any cabinet minutes knows what a farce they are. They're just exercises in obfuscation. And secondly, if you'll forgive my contradicting you, on the authority of having been a member of the British Labour Party since 1945, we didn't spend a lot of time on Clause 4. All Clause 4 ever did was give a chance for the left to have a great big row at conference and win the Conservatives some votes in marginal seats. That didn't really take up a lot of people's time. I've been very interested in listening to what's been said today. Lovely to hear Francis again. Many at a time we've wrestled over microphones in places like Birmingham and other parts of the West Midlands. But I haven't heard anything about why the civil service behaves the way it does. There was one occasion when I found myself in a coach in Turkey, sitting next to a very distinguished former Conservative defence minister. whose name I certainly won't announce today. And I said, my God, I envy you. You were number 1, I was only number 2. What the difference is, and so on and so forth. How did you like it? He said, I loved it, except when they lied to me. My opinion of him shot up immediately, because I think it takes a very big man to acknowledge that people have been lying to you. When you acknowledge that people have been lying to you, acknowledge that they despise you. And I thought he was very courageous. He's a very distinguished Conservative Defence Secretary. And I'll tell you one other little story. I personally witnessed, beyond any contradiction at all, the participation of a permanent Under-Secretary in a conspiracy to deceive his Secretary of State. Now, if I go on like that, I'll sound paranoid as Tony Benn, won't I? But why do they behave like this? It's very strange. But they do lie to you. I'm very sorry to tell you, and it hasn't changed. And I can say that because I've been there twice, over a gap of many years. And they have fear of all sorts of things. I can remember frenzied debate once about what the auditors would say about something we were proposing to do. And I said, well, why don't we find out? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, why don't you pick up the phone and ask them? Couldn't do that. Couldn't do that. Absolutely out of the question. They have the most extraordinary attitude, civil servants. I speak as the son of a civil servant who was actually on the Beveridge report. Started off as a boy clerk before the First World War. One of the very few who ended up in the administrative grade after the Second World War. That's a feat not often accomplished. So I'm very proud of the civil service. But they lie to you. Why do they lie to you? If you want to change things, that's the sort of question you've got to answer.
So you have 3 good questions there. One about how you get more permeability, one specifically about the Brodie-Clark case, and then one about why civil servants lie to you. Who wants to take on which of those?
Can I just briefly have a footnote on nationalisation? Because Ian Mikado at the 44 Labour Party conference, to the horror of Herbert Morrison, put the great nationalisation programme into the manifesto, in effect, and Herbert took him on one side and said, young man, you've just lost us the next general election. And then the huge range of nationalisation. And also in your time, shipbuilding being nationalised, iron and steel, wasn't marginal, it was big stuff for a while. As you well know.
I think with this we'll take this offline, as it were.
We can debate it.
Yeah. We'll talk next week.
On this point about how you get the greater permeability, Francis, where have we got to on that?
I don't know really. I mean, it's really tough to do. I think the inside of a Department of State is an unreasonably unique environment, and they need to change. It needs to be more like, they're not businesses, they're not going to be businesses, but they can feel more like ordinary other organisations. They don't have to feel so different. And until there's much more kind of sense that this is a normal organisation, it will be very difficult to get permeability.
Did you want to take the point about Brodie-Clark?
Well, I think I'm at least a person to say that, but I do remember Michael Howard, the head of prisons, when we were in opposition, also having a similar problem of who was going to take responsibility for things. I don't know that it's necessarily about innovation in that case. I think there's a problem in the relationship between civil servants and ministers. We've never really got it quite right what we mean by accountability. And I think actually that's where the lying point comes in too. I mean, saying civil servants lie to ministers, I mean, I guess some people believe that politicians lie to the population in general, so maybe it's all just goes around and the lying works its way through the system. But I do think there's a real problem in the relationship between ministers and civil servants. I think the point Francis made earlier about the need to have the head of the civil service manage the top several layers of the civil service, which does not happen at the moment. I got into trouble in a seminar chaired by Peter before '97 when I said that we wanted to move from a feudal system to a Napoleonic system. Someone unkindly put in the newspapers my name attached to it. And of course, using a Napoleonic
name off it.
No, well, that was when you. The idea that we're going to do something French was immediately a problem. There is an issue that the departments, permanent secretaries of departments, think their responsibility is only to their Secretary of State. And in fact, their responsibility should also be to the head of the civil service, who should be managing them and the civil servants below them. The minister is responsible not for running the department, but responsible for setting the policy and setting the strategy. And that relationship never really quite settles down to the right sort of shape that it needs to be. And I think only then will you get to the right relationship of that, instead of being them and us between ministers and civil servants. There's also a problem that Francis referred to earlier, which is being able to sack civil servants. We had a permanent secretary in our early years who caused absolutely catastrophic damage, and we wanted to sack. And after about 2 months, the cabinet secretary came to us and said he couldn't be sacked, but he could be promoted to another job to get around the way. And we said we weren't prepared to settle for that. He came back 6 months later, and it cost the government several £1 million to get rid of him. So there's a real problem in being able to get rid of people if they have performed badly. I just think this relationship between ministers, civil servants, and accountability has never really been settled in our system.
I'm afraid, I know that there are still lots of questions in the room. I'm afraid we haven't run out of time. There is wine in the back of the room, so some of you I hope will be able to continue the conversation there. But it's been incredibly enlightening evening. This is something that Policy Change is getting more and more interested in. Everybody's asked good and enlightening questions, and it only really remains for us to thank our brilliant speakers this evening. Thank you.